Good afternoon. Welcome to our public conversation for Quintessence's production of Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth. My name is Daniel Ciba, and I'm the new Educational Programs Manager for Quintessence. I'm joined today by Quintessence's Artistic Director, Alexander Burns, who directed the production, and our special guest, Amos Tappan Wilder. Tappan is Thornton Wilder's nephew and has served as the literary executor since 1995 over the course of his tenure. Tappan has contributed to Wilder scholarship, including published notes with all of his uncle's plays and novels, in addition to lecturing widely about Wilder. He has been responsible for encouraging subsidiary works based on his uncle's major texts. Tappan is honorary president of the Thornton Wilder Society. His contribution to his uncle's legacy has ensured that all Thornton Wilder's novels and plays are in print and readily accessible. So thank you both for joining us today. As my first event as the Quintessence's new educational programs manager, I wanted to frame this public conversation about our summer production in the hopes that this conversation supplements watching the on-demand production and raises some helpful insights and questions about the challenges and the potentials of a piece like The Skin of Our Teeth. When I was asked for a title for this event, I gravitated towards Sabina as the character who has the most overt audience interaction. And right before the curtain falls, she says, "The end of this play isn't written yet," a line which calls attentions to Wilder's structure of connecting the end of the play back to the beginning, back to the opening moments. But this line also represents how the play, through new productions, will inevitably acquire new meanings. So I'd like to focus today's conversation about thinking through the potentials for the play to gain new life through production. I have some opening questions, and then we'll open it up to group questions of discussion. For those of you who are viewing us live on Facebook, feel free to type questions as they occur to you in the comments, and I'll find ways to integrate them into some questions and thoughts I've received from audience members as they've been watching the production throughout this period that we've been presenting it. And then we also have, very excitingly, some live members of our Zoom room, some subscribers and other supporters of Quintessence who are joining us today to join in the conversation live. I'd like to get started by really asking Mr. Wilder, you've done so much to contribute to your uncle's legacy, and I know you probably get this question over and over again about his plays, but I really think it's important for our audiences and for us to start this conversation just hearing what you have to say about the origins of The Skin of Our Teeth and whatever context you think is the most helpful about how your uncle wrote the play and why.
Well, that's a big question. You know, the Guido Sarducci history of Wilder as a playwright, I think, includes a chapter on the extraordinary 1930s to 1942 when The Skin of Our Teeth is written. I mean, he starts as a novelist in the 20s, always wanting to write plays. But he publishes 3 novels, of which one is very famous, The Bridge of San Luis Rey. And he goes into the 30s having earned over $2 million in our money from his novels. He's just a hugely well-known figure. I say he could have published anything and it would have been collected. But he wants to write plays, and so he starts writing these little one-act plays in the early 30s. One of them... I think, I'm sure you all, those of you who are theater buffs know The Happy Journey to Trenton and Camden and The Long Christmas Dinner, an extraordinary play, and Pullman Car Hiawatha, the end of which becomes part, in a way, adapted into The Bridge of San Luis Rey. Then he races through the 30s, one little novel, suddenly does Our Town in 38, and another huge strike. And he's playing with all kinds of form now. He's doing what he wanted to do, write plays. He's worried about farce. What's the difference between farce, comedy? He's playing with all these forms. And then he does a play which is a bit of a failure. We know it today as the great success, The Matchmaker. And then he gets sort of tired. At the end of the 30s, I'm about to end this speech, is a really interesting period in his life. And I was going back and looking at some old files. I realized how interesting it was, where he decides to get an apartment in New York, not far from where Beryl Street Theater is, which was going to be famous for an Our Town production in our time. And he does a little writing about the nature of theater. He writes an introduction to Oedipus Rex. He writes a wonderful, important essay everybody reads on the nature of theater. He helps advise on how the Our Town movie can be made and the differences between the play. He goes to Latin America for a couple of months on a goodwill mission. He goes here, he goes there. And in terms of about to end this speech, one of the play that he's adapting is called The Beau Stratagem by Farquhar, a late restoration comedy that he's doing for Cheryl Crawford, coming out of the group theater. And he gets halfway through and the war is breaking out and he just has to give it up. And he suddenly starts to write The Bridge of San Luis. He starts to write The Skin of Our Teeth, in which he throws all this experience from the 30s into it. It's a friend of mine said that going to a production of The Skin of Our Teeth is like being in a lifeboat in the middle of a stormy sea. Form, function, experience, what's theater versus the movie. And one event that he had in this period, which ends up there, he gives a national radio broadcast to support Roosevelt's election in 1940 at Hyde Park with Mrs. Roosevelt present. And yes, that turns up too. He throws the kitchen sink into this play. And it opens, of course, with the war in full swing. He's already in uniform. And it's an highly experimental, fascinating piece of work. And it's constantly being rediscovered. In many ways, like Our Town, we may be interesting for us to talk about the difference between Our Towns and The Skin of Our Teeth, but I think I've already talked long enough just to open up the general question of the variety of experiences he had and this vast learning, how he pours religion, he pours his knowledge of the classics, wisdom. I'd like to end, though, with a line he wrote when he was writing The Bridge of San Luis Rey, where it really all began. He wrote, I wanted to make sure I had it right, when a situation is more than a human soul can be expected to bear, what then? And I like to say that my whole uncle's life and his works and fiction and drama was devoted to figuring out what it is that could help all of us get out of bed in the morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those.
Speech.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those insights. And I think it is just really important, right? Especially as people are reflecting on Quintessence's productions, just to sort of keep that in mind, that Wilder is, not only is it experimental, but Wilder is putting in a whole bunch of different references. It's a smorgasbord of different ideas, and that is maybe one of the reasons why there might be conflict and paradox in even some of the basic levels of the play. Funnily enough, I'm so glad, it was so interesting you brought up the Beau Stratagem. I was actually in a production of the Beau Stratagem that used the version that Wilder initiated and was finished later. So again, it's just really interesting.
Only got halfway through. And Ken Ludwig finished it. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah, and to think about like, oh, he was in the middle of writing this comedy, and then he just had to adapting that classic work and then had to stopped that to pick up Skin of Our Teeth. So that's a really interesting residency. Another question, and this is really for both of you. Although there have been consistently productions of The Skin of Our Teeth, a lot in educational settings, audiences and critics continue to have mixed reactions to the work. So, can we talk just a little bit about why we think audiences have not fully embraced this play in a way that maybe audiences have embraced Our Town more?
You want to go first, Alex, or shall I go?
I'm happy to give my opinion on that question. I find it very fascinating in the American theater in general, how much audiences like and have been trained to like theater audiences, plays that ask simple questions, have a simple arc of narrative and a simple resolution either towards comedy or tragedy. When things become more complicated than that in the American theater, and we leave the nuclear family or add too many different questions or too much nuance or too much paradox, I find that there's a lot of confusion. And we as American theater goers love to know and understand everything that's happening at all times. And if anything in the theater that we're seeing either takes the language to a heightened level or takes the questions to a level of existentialism or philosophy or anything outside of the quotidian, or even if the narrative becomes too vast, I find that unlike in the European tradition, we like to freak out and say, this is too confusing, this is too complicated, I'm lost. And one of my favorite things about the theater in general is being in a state of wonderment. And I think in all of Thornton Wilder's works and in many great plays, you're constantly challenged to rethink about how you look at the world and how you've presumed certain truths and certain universal dictates or dictums or realities or laws. And because of the way he's crafted the events of the drama and the way he uses language, you suddenly see something in a completely new way, something that is so mundane. I mean, the mundane is such a key part in both Our Town and Skin of Our Teeth, becomes revolutionary or sublime. And conversely, something as biblical or epic as a flood becomes just this sort of denouement in what is ultimately a domestic family crisis. And so that to me is the genius of his work, and ultimately why I think our audiences, specifically American audiences, freak out around his play, this play in particular.
That's a beautiful statement. I think we can all go home now. That's great. That's wonderful. I think it's fair to say, and just to add a footnote, from a practical point of view, the size of this play is daunting, and many theater directors, I met a great many theater directors over the years who've always dreamed about doing it, but just didn't see how to do it, how to budget for it, you see. And one of the very brilliant things that you've done with this production, Alex, is show how very few people can take this play and do extraordinary things with it. It's your production is a really a major achievement. And maybe we can come back, I hope, and talk about it as in the context of the pandemic, of course, because I had a sort of a sense that what your cast had done, and they're a remarkable team, the way they work together, it's just extraordinary, that they've been through something not unlike, in a way, maybe they don't have Tallulah Bankhead, thank heavens, but they went through the experience here of a war. We live in a very much a kind of war. I think the third act particularly resonant. We can come back later. But what I was going to say is, Dan, there are major productions of this play that come along pretty regularly.
Oh, okay.
Denver, Colorado. I mean, not every year, but sometimes, Williamstown. And they're more than you might think. They're just perhaps not as visible as we would like them to be. And they've been remarkable. I saw one just a few years ago, Damaso Rodriguez in Portland. It was a remarkable production. I didn't see the one in Denver. But of course, the Theater for a New Audience recently in New York with Aaron Arbus, they do come along. But again, it's an experimental play, and you've maintained the integrity of the play from top to bottom, but shown how a very small cast with no audience but your friends can survive. And therefore, you've kind of you've gone through another fourth wall for this play. It's very, very special.
And that actually segues beautifully into sort of the last question before we'll really open up to the people in the audience. And if anyone has any questions from the Facebook Live audience, is really talking about the connections between this play and the pandemic, right? How does the play and the production speak to the pandemic? As I was watching, it just really became very clear, reflecting on each of the moments in each of the acts, right? These major moments of crisis, the Ice Age, Noah and the Flood, the war in the third act, right? If we think about like the shared experiences over the past 17 months of the pandemic, it is really clear. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, in their review of our production, called this the right show for the right moment. And I feel like it's important for us to really unpack like what that means in terms of, as you were just saying, the process of creating the play itself is just mirroring, it's just echoed. And in terms of what do we do when we feel like it's the end of the world? I think that is a really strong part of the play. And again, maybe goes back and answers a little bit of that, like that, the mixed reactions to it, right? That's a really hard question to grapple with, right? What do we do when we feel like we're at the end of the world? So I don't know if either of you have additional thoughts in terms of like how the production, the approach to the production speaks to the pandemic, or that being just another way into thinking about what the core of this piece is.
Well, Alex, you speak, and I'll be glad to come into that.
Certainly. Well, what's amazing is that when we decided that we were going to do this piece, it was in May of 2020. So it was after the original lockdown that had happened, and we all sort of felt like somehow the world was beginning to reopen and return last summer, without knowing what was this last year afterwards was going to be. And I've always been frustrated by how people have called The Skin of Our Teeth absurdism, because I find so much of the behavior of the characters to be quite rational in the context of the crisis that they're in. And I felt like we saw a lot of that irrational behavior in our own country leading up into the crisis with COVID. So this really felt like a perfect piece. I also feel like so many families, so many individuals in our country had been so busy and working so hard that they really hadn't had to deal with each other or their own personal crises or their own domestic dramas. And then suddenly they were locked in a house with their kids and with their spouses and with their actual life and their brain with all that time. And that crisis that occurred there, I think, was also profound. And I think it's one that in the three scenarios we get to watch Wilder explore. And I feel like there's no playwright who sort of captures the American voice. I don't care for the word authentic, but as powerfully or potently as Thornton Wilder does. And there are so many words in the play that were of our moment. And we have a 42-page document that we had to approve or send to Actors Equity, the Actors Union, just to be allowed to do the project. So a lot of the ingenuity of casting and the cardboard cutouts was literally because we weren't allowed to have any more people in the room by dictates of the union. And I was determined to try and figure out how to tell this story and this play, because I did feel like this voice, this story, as we try and figure out how to reopen, even more than in the crisis, I think this play speaks to how you recover and how you continue more than it does even how you endure during crisis. I felt such a need to try and pull this off. So what's amazing about watching it now, and that you as an audience don't get a feeling of, was we were in masks every day in rehearsal. And every day when you arrived at the theater, you'd have to sign in and do a COVID question and answer and do a COVID test. And the only times people had masks off was when they were actually acting on stage in a moment. And directing with a mask on the whole time was just a thing that I hope to never have to do again, but probably will. And it all added to what this play was exploring, which was, how do you find a way of communicating and connecting and building a community in the face of this insanity? So we didn't have to work very hard for all of that. And there were so many little lines which are very funny in the play that we'd almost start crying, because the absurdity of it was so present for all of us in the room as we were literally just trying to survive and not get sick and die, and also trying to do a play, knowing that there would never be an audience for it, knowing that if we're lucky, a couple of people would stream this down the road, but the act of us coming together after a year of literally not being able to be in a room together to create art and performance in theater was that important to all of us. So yeah, it was that whole aspect of it was such a gift. And I feel so lucky that I had this opportunity, both with the Thornton Wilder, but also with this moment and with these artists, to really take this on its full epic level. And I am just fascinated, Tappan, just in terms of the history of this production. We kept talking about like being an audience on Broadway in 1942 and watching the world sort of implode and democracy getting sort of pushed to its limits. And we've just watched that in our own country over the last 4 years. And it was just fascinating, the themes of the ideals of democracy and how you are a leader and how you are a patriarch and how you are a matriarch, and the responsibilities and the burdens and the failures and the complexities are so powerful in this piece. And it's just fascinating to imagine being an American on Broadway, watching Cliff Montgomery, Tallulah Bankhead in this play, where the actors are literally talking to you and sort of calling you out, and also breaking your heart and also making you laugh, and what that experience would have been like. And that's a theater event that I wish I could go back to, just to see what it was like in that room.
Well, it's wonderful. It's as we, you say it very well, Alex, beautifully. I think this is I said, going back to my earlier remarks, what is it makes us get out of bed every morning? And this play is absolutely zeroes in on the family, for example, and how the family takes many forms in our day, but the family still survives. And as you say, you've done it in the context of a war we're at, a worldwide war on this thing called a pandemic, which isn't over. But the third act, I think, which is always my favorite of almost all Wilder acts, I mean, that has the kitchen sink in it. And there's evil, there's forgiveness, there's every conceivable form of trying to keep this family together and moving on. It's just remarkable to me. But there's one thing I'd like to point out that I think becomes more and more clear as we get into this century, and as we go forward to celebrating now 125 years of my uncle soon, and that is the role that the woman plays. And And in the pandemic, it's interesting, you know, I read about women being back in the kitchen. Did that ever come up? It's very moving, you know. The burdens that are carried by women seem to me very special and are pointed up in this play. And, you know, Dolly Levi and Wilder was always writing about them. And I find that terribly interesting. And I hope your listeners have a chance to, if they haven't seen your production, to see how you handle the fortune teller. Think it over. Think it over, George. You failed. Think it over. A new world to make. And here we are asking those questions.
Yeah, I particularly think that
when I went out the other day for the first time and I saw people walking their dogs for the first time in a year. Mrs. Antrobus gets up and sees, I forget, what's he doing down the street?
sweeping, right? Sweeping.
And those are all experiences. And will we be able to do it? Because the question plays very hard. This is very dark. Evil is ever present in this play. Death and evil are everywhere. That's true of our town too. Can we do it? Can we do it? And he believes absolutely that we can, but he sure asks hard questions.
And I totally agree that even the pairing of Fitzpatrick and the fortune teller and sort of seeing those overlaps in this production in specific was also really interesting to sort of think about, like that fortune teller character also being more predominant as Janice was playing those characters in relation to each other. And
I've never seen her have the whole stage to herself, you see.
Oh, yes.
Remarkable. I've never seen that. Heard every word more clearly than I've ever heard it. I've heard a lot of the language in this play, Alex, thanks to what you did, very clearly. The words are very clear. Thank you for the introduction.
Wonderful. So I think now it's time for us to open up. So I have to click some buttons. If you give me 1 second. So for any members of the Zoom audience who want to turn on their cameras, and then we can sort of signal if you have questions or want to join in the conversation, or I can start with either questions people emailed in to sort of continue the conversation, or Facebook comments. So does anyone want to start? Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Wilder, your dad was a professor of divinity at Harvard. And to what extent did his relationship with your uncle influence the writing of those plays or his general approach to things literary? Is there an undercurrent of hopefulness that was in their interactions?
Could I ask? I'm delighted you asked that question, and I think I have a pretty good answer for it. But I'd like to. Could you tell us how you came to ask it? It's a wonderful question. Thank you.
Well, I'm a Presbyterian clergyman, and I've read a number of your father's books, and I've read a great deal of Wilder, and so
yeah,
the question was natural for me to
Thank
read.
you. Thank you. And, you know, I'm very proud that all of my uncle's major works are in print. So you can't avoid them if you want to get them. And that's true of my father's. 17 of my father's books are back in print through Wimpf and Stock,
Yeah.
including his classic Eschatology and Ethics in the Teaching of Jesus,
Right.
which is very
Great book.
great book. And the answer to your question is yes. These were two brothers, Penelope Niven, who wrote the definitive biography of Wilder, and it's only been out a few years. One of the first things I did after I took over managing my uncle's estate is I found two major archives that nobody'd ever seen. And hundreds of Wilder's letters. It's a long story. Penny Niven was the first biographer to use them. She was amazed that these two brothers were not jealous of each other. She couldn't find any, and it's true, they absolutely adored each other, and they were close. Their conversations in the corner are not recorded on YouTube, so we don't have them. But they both had, as I say, religious imaginations. My uncle's was somewhat different from my father's, but both of them, I think, found themselves dealing with the same issue, as I said in the beginning. When there's no hope anywhere for anything, what is it that we draw on to try and build a world? My father fought in the First World War. It affected him terribly. He married late as a result of it. He could have been my grandfather, and he had he wrote a poem that my uncle really loved, and it has the line, "The null point breeds new algebras." The null point. You go to the bottom and then you start building up. And that's the sense of the two brothers. Yes, they talked about eschatology, all those things together. And here's the good news for you, dear sir. There is a whole book written about Amos Wilder and Thornton Wilder and the shape of American religion. And you can get it through Notre Dame Press, and it's Christopher Wheatley wrote it, retired now from the Catholic University faculty. And it's a wonderful book and very important book, and goes into great detail on just some of the questions you asked. Yes, they certainly did discuss things.
Yeah, and again, and maybe this is just also my father being a minister too, but sort of really thinking about like the connections of religion that occur over and over again throughout the piece, but again, like really intertwining that with like the domestic family situations, right? In what ways is religion a real part of everyday life and spirituality actually interconnected for many people with the ongoing day-to-day, as opposed to just something that happens on Sundays?
My uncle was not doctrinaire church member. He was a storyteller, and he'll use anything to write a story. As he used to say, he's like, I build my nest from the best. He steals anywhere he can get them, right? And so the religious tradition and the lessons learned, and some of them are not so pleasant, are part of his repertoire and important. So he's doing that. My father was practicing it more as a ordained clergyman. He was and he was a professor. His last job, a professor of New Testament at Harvard Divinity School. He roamed everywhere. Yep, he was a storyteller. He stole from the best, including Christianity and the Old Testament, I might add.
One of the things that we did in rehearsal during our first week, I'm a big proponent of table work, where you sit and you really talk about every word that is spoken and the references and the sort of allegories, and we read through Genesis as part of that process, and it was fascinating. We had from the King James Bible, and we had a whole diverse group of religious upbringing and backgrounds, and the only way I can describe it is shock at the stories in Genesis and how they paralleled and what Thornton Wilder took, but more importantly, just the style of storytelling, the characters being aged thousands of years, the history of taking you through the great families of Noah and that whole style of storytelling, and seeing how Wilder sort of brought that all in. And I'm always fascinated in the role that God plays in theater, in its tradition from the Greeks all the way to today. And what was so infinitely fascinating to me is the God force in this play is sort of absent in a way, or we never get to know who that God force is. We never know who the director is or who the playwright is. We just hear the playwright's an idiot who writes crappy plays, and we hear that the director is gone, and yet the sets are being asked to sort of transform and malfunction, and we're tearing up the theater, and I just love that meta theatrical aspect of the whole event on a spiritual level, asking sort of who is writing the play, and who is in control of it. And is the stage manager sort of a god force, or is the stage manager just another employee of sort of an absentee father or boss? And then also in this play in particular, I was just so thrilled by how I felt Thornton Wilder was challenging us to look at how fundamental these religious ideas are. This morality is in the fabric of the sort of American vision, in terms of the family, in terms of the community, in terms of just the whole outlook, and where that is our strength, and then where that is hindering us as a society. And I feel like he does such an amazing job of just asking that question through drama over and over again, through event over and over again, without actually giving us any answers, but just allowing us to laugh and to question.
If you don't have a sense of humor, Alex, you're not going to like this play. People who don't have a sense of humor don't enjoy it. I've got a friend who just has absolutely no sense of humor. He couldn't make hide her hair out of it, and couldn't wait to get out of there. Right? I don't think people walk out of this theater the way they did when it was first done, but you've got to have a sense of humor. You've just got to have it. And you're laughing at yourself, and it makes you more human. You know what I mean? But it's that third act is really something. George is evil. I mean, not George. Henry's evil. Cain is evil. It's real.
Well, actually, that might lead us to have. So we have a comment from. We have a question from one of the Facebook Live audience members. Jose had discovered Skin of Our Teeth, different editions, different versions of the script, and he found one that was a slim paperback edition that had the breaking of the fourth wall moment in the third act between Henry and Mr. Antrobus being toned down and not so dangerous. And so, again, the question is, it's actually humorous. Tappan, do you know, sort of in terms of any distinction between different versions of that moment with Henry and Mr. Antrobus when Henry attacks Mr. Antrobus, and then they stop the play because that's really dangerous?
I'd have to ask a very specific question there. Is what two editions is the individual looking at? In 1957, Thornton Wilder basically cleaned up, relatively modestly, cleaned up the version that had been done on Broadway and was in an acting edition. And
so this version was in a volume that was called Three Plays. So it's the three plays.
Yes, well, three play that would be the way Thornton Wilder. That would be his definitive view, and that's the one that exists in the current individual, the current reading edition. This is what with Paula Vogel's wonderful introduction. That's the version with minor changes. I noticed reading it, so I can't give a definitive answer to that, except that's what Thornton Wilder wanted. Suddenly, that's a great moment, by the way, a very great moment where, we have evil back in the house, real evil. I mean, Henry is the real thing here. And suddenly it becomes so difficult, so tense, that Thornton Wilder suddenly turns to the Oedipal complex to kind of break things up. And, he jumps on his father and tries to strangle him, and they have to pull him apart. And then we hear the discussion about his upbringing and family, and was it true? Was it not true? Honestly, the breaking the fourth wall on these it takes the pressure off, because it becomes very tense in the theater when these things happen, very tense. And may I ask a quick question of Alex on how One thing I do not do, Alex, you'll be grateful for this, I think, is I do not burden directors necessarily with Thornton's views about how certain scenes should be done. But eventually his views in form of published letters and whatnot do get into print. Recently, for instance, we published his letters to Alan Schneider, who directed a very important production in the 50s. And he talks about how difficult it is for the actors. Mary Martin had a hard time, particularly, trying to step out of their role as actors and break the fourth wall and speak as Mary Martin. And was that a problem for your actors to do that? Because those are important moments in the...
Yes, I mean, I personally love those moments. Just going all the way back to Shakespeare with the soliloquy, I always believe those are moments where the character/actor is speaking directly to the audience in real time. And so that's something that I love playing with. And it's always a challenge for the actor. And I think for us, the big question was, when the character was speaking to the audience, are they speaking to the audience as an actor in a production in 1942? Or are they speaking to the audience as themselves in 2021 during COVID? And that became even more meta when we were talking about the fact that we only had an audience of cardboard cutouts. So did they know they were talking to an empty theater of cardboard cutouts, or were they actually pretending that those individuals were real human beings? And I challenged everyone to allow us to imagine that this was a real performance with cardboard cutouts, knowing that there was also a live audience watching virtually, and trying to find out if the actor could actually speak as themselves to the camera. And I think what we really loved finding was that in this moment of social media, where people are constantly talking live into their phones and broadcasting their own personal views and opinions quite aggressively, in terms of just passionately and finding their own kind of authentic or real voice. Thornton Wilder was doing the exact same thing back in 1942 of allowing specifically Sabina to step out into her role as an actor and challenge the experience. And so that was really a thrill, and we wanted to push that. And I think our only sadness was the fact that we didn't have a live audience to play with in those moments, because everyone in the room really enjoyed getting to play both their character as an actor, as well as their character in the play, as well as finding where they themselves as an artist today fit into that triumvirate.
As more people have questions in the Zoom room, feel free to raise your hand and I can signal if someone else has a question. But Tappan, you can respond and then we can continue.
I'll step down. I'd love to hear some more questions.
Cool. Do we have another question? Yeah, Carrie.
I'm going to just unmute myself. Mr. Wilder, thank you so much for pointing out how important it is to the play and how important it is to this production that it centers on the family and the domestic unit. And you're quite right about the extraordinary importance of the role of women and the magnificent speech that Mrs. Antrobus has in the second act. I'd like to turn that observation that you made about the play into a question for Alex about the degree to which the gendering may have been a challenge in 2021.
Yes, it was a real challenge trying to, specifically with an actor of the power of Rachel Bay Jones, who has throughout her career kind of taken on these powerhouse female roles. It was interesting to navigate Maggie as the mother. And what was really important to both of us was to look at what it is about the ability of a person to run a home and to create a family unit and to build a community through this idea of the family. what were the challenges, what were the strengths, what were the failures, and to really allow that woman to be as kind of real and powerful as possible. The characters are so rich, and in the first act, when Sabina, the maid, and the matriarch have a confrontation over who controls the patriarch, both romantically and sexually, that to me is, I just can't imagine what it would have been like to have been in a theater in 1942 where that conversation was happening in such an open, potent way between those two women. And it's also incredibly funny. And we were able to kind of move through it in that way. I think the place where we got really caught was at the end of the third act, because as written, George sort of takes over and almost is sort of becoming a kind of leader teacher and informing the family, Maggie in particular, how to think and how to process and how to move forward. And it was really important to us that we gave Maggie and Gladys volition, other than just being the woman at the right of the man and the daughter with the child for the future, but they're actually part of the sort of brain bank that is being created at that time. So that was really interesting.
And it's that decision to bring the daughter and her baby onto the stage quietly and have her sit down there. That was very beautiful, by the way. That's what you're talking about in part, right?
Yes, and I was really determined that you could see that she was reading Sylvia Plath, but it wasn't, we weren't able to pull that off, so.
Speaking of humor, that was a wonderful question, by the way, Carrie, thoughtful. Many productions I've seen, they always pick the name of a local deli, around the corner from the theater. You decided not to do that, right? Obviously, they work it out with the deli. Do we have your permission for the, you didn't do that.
Yeah, no, we had originally hoped that we were going to be able to leave the theater and just pull the volunteers out of the crowd. But when we were shooting it at the time, COVID was making a comeback. And so we had to simplify our plans and pivot. A lot of those kind of ideas for us were very trying to navigate the environment at the time. But yes, I just, the fact that Thornton Wilder and his estate are so, that's part of the world of this theater, that it is so kind of alive and present, is really wonderful. Not true of all of the great American writers.
Well, yeah, I'm Rosie and I are open to questions always, but I also have to add that David knows the name Coffin, who was a great preacher at Yale, who was influenced on my generation. And he used to say to us all the time, if you stand for nothing, you fall for anything. So I'm ready to say no sometimes, but it's true. I think the future of this play is of enormous interest to me, obviously, as a manager. Where do we go? And that was a theme you picked up, Dan, in the beginning. And I appreciated that. Where does our skin of our teeth go over the next 10 years? Well, in the play, it says we know the future, but we don't know the past. Well, we know there's a musical that's been written and by Ethan Lipton. And I hope it'll be done sooner rather than later. It'll be very interesting to see whether it can evolve in that direction. I believe it can be. We'll see. That's one thing. And the other thing I'd like to mention, just put on the record, is that as we go forward in the next years, I'm going to be trying to spend more and more attention to how this play is received abroad in foreign countries, because it is performed out there. It's just that we don't know much about those performances. So that means finding translators and interviewing. And I think that's an important part of what this play will be in the future. And I think you've inspired me to take that even more seriously.
Do we have time for one or two more questions? So I don't know if someone has a burning question in the room.
Tappan, did you get to see the Candor and Ebb workshops of their musical version when they were working on that?
I did, all of them, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had the rights for, I guess, some 15 years, and it didn't work out. Mm. My family and I decided to go in a very different direction.
Yeah,
a younger sensibility. You see, we like people your age, by the way.
Yeah.
So I have a question from the chat here, just asking to know what Thornton Wilder was like in terms of personality. Pleasant, angry, relaxed? Did he have a structured day? Do you have anything you can share in terms of just the insights into your uncle?
Listen, very simply, did he have a structured day? That's a wonderful question. This is a man who built a home for himself and his family in 1930 with some of that money I mentioned earlier, right? In Hamden, Connecticut. But he spent his life basically not always on the road, but away. And he did not have a structured, he had structured experiences, but he was not a highly disciplined person that way. He was always trying to find a place to write. And long walks, 15 miles a day, not unusual to try and get the scene. Writing's not easy. He was a wonderful teacher. That's a whole nother lecture. You're not going to get it. But he was a marvelous uncle to me. When he was home in New Haven, where I was a student and worked for many years, I would see him, and he would, I'd get the phone call, and we'd have these wonderful dinners. He was a splendid person, didn't get angry, but he was a very serious fellow, serious about being funny, serious about everything. He wanted life to be taken seriously, but also joyously. And I'm not going to read, you can get the volume of his letters and read the ones to me that ended up in there, and you get a sense of, I wish I'd had an uncle like that. He was interested in my ideas, what I was thinking about, and I always had to kind of prepare a little bit for dinner, and he wasn't too interested in whether, Yale was going to beat Princeton. He'd rather hear what was I learning from my course in French? What was I learning about the French novel? And then he'd sit back and give me his views, which were always fascinating. And he wrote me a number of letters. Often he said, I want you to learn to laugh. Be sure you can learn to laugh. And I've been laughing ever since, thanks to him.
No, and I think it's just great to sort of like approach the play from a variety of directions, right? In watching this production, and then also sort of researching the criticism about The Skin of Our Teeth, right? One of the things that I've heard over and over again is this: it's not a play where if you just watch it once, you are actually able to grapple with and sort of think about the variety of things that are happening. Maybe it's too epic, maybe it's too big, maybe the ideas actually require this sort of reflection. And I think sort of these two directions of like, is it helpful to understand more about who Thornton Wilder was and as a person, but also really thinking about it as a text, right? As a great work of literature. And, as we conclude, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about this piece is the ending with the hours and the philosophers. And I think going from a point where it starts off as this like humorous interjection, right, where the stage manager comes out and says we can't do these things, and then there are some dark jokes about food poisoning, right, and sort of like explaining the conceit that will then become the moment that ends the play. The reason I'm bringing this up is I really see this direct connection between Mr. Antrobus calling forward these ideas from these books, these things that, if you imagine someone in the middle of a war, right, going back and reflecting on the literature as something that can impact and help you through some of these moments of crisis. Because Quintessence's mission is to re-envision the classics for contemporary audiences, I'd love to hear from members of our Zoom room or anyone sort of this, like thinking through the value of the classic work during these times of crisis, right? What does it mean to go to a play like Skin of Our Teeth as, again, maybe asking questions rather than looking for answers, but really as something that can provide comfort or maybe something else entirely, right? What do these works of literature that we return to actually provide us? It's a very big question to end on. I had a much easier question written down, and then in the process of asking the question, it became much more complex, inspired by the thoughts circulating this room.
Well, I think, Dan, what you're saying is you have a profound hope and a commitment, and it's your life that great art unites us rather than divides us. And we live in such a deeply divided world that the artist is part of the way forward. And asks the question and provide some very human answers to community. And a play like this, which is all families, not just those living in Excelsior, New Jersey, and in our town, it's about all towns everywhere. Maybe Thornton Wilder will be very much part of the future, because he raises the right questions and the answers have large unifying implications for a very broken world. I don't know. What do you think, Alex? You're the director of this theater. I'm sorry, I've never been to see it. My grandmother lived in Moorestown, New Jersey, and it was at my father's wedding there that Thornton Wilder learned the conceit he uses in the second act. And my mother's wedding dress is on permanent display in Moorestown, because that's partly where our town was really born, right on your doorstep. So I know Philadelphia, and I wish you all well there.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I wish that there were more writers taking risks at using the classics and using the words and questions and creating new American stories with them. And I think that there are some that are very exciting, but it really is just as a piece the message at the heart of Skin of Our Teeth, the idea that what keeps him alive is the voice and of the voice popular and its movement forward, the idea of the family and the domestic space that he's created himself, and then the idea of the great works or the great thoughts or the great sort of achievements, to me are such wonderfully high ideals. And as we struggle with the integrity of those ideals in America and figuring out what America is growing into and must become for those three sort of fronts, I do love that we can have Thornton Wilder as kind of a beacon to help us with that question. And I really just think this play does it in a way that there really isn't another one quite like it. I just wish that more people would go on the ride. It's so interesting how eager people are to get off this particular journey. And so that's been interesting. And I know that that has been the case with this play, like many great plays since its inception. So
Beautifully put.
So thank you all. Oh, do you have a concluding thought, Mr. Wilder?
No, I've enjoyed wonderful questions, and thank you, Alex. Thank you, Dan, for your thoughtful care of this remarkable play.
Yeah, we are so grateful and honored that you were able to share some time with us, and to sort of make these connections. One of my initiatives as the educational program manager at Quintessence is to find more opportunities like this, making space for audience conversation and reflection as part of every production that we do. Although this virtual discussion is only the first step, I am committed to really finding ways to further the classics forwards approach and really think about the way that reflection, especially for a work like The Skin of Our Teeth, is a necessary part of the journey. Thank you, Mr. Wilder, for joining us. For anyone who is watching on Facebook Live who has yet to see the production, tickets are still on sale until tomorrow night at midnight, and they include a 72-hour streaming window. So if you are interested, you can visit www.qtgrep.org. Sorry, that's the first time I've actually said the website aloud, so I probably should have prepared that. But anyway, you can visit our website to purchase tickets online or reach out to our box office. But thank you all for everyone who is able to join us today. And Quintessence looks forward to continuing our conversations going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you very much.
Lovely. So we can stop recording.